we'd mentioned the other day in the name of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh that the basis for spiritual contamination is that the nether forces, they're attracted to something because of the degree of Kedusha, which it has, and the greater degree of innate Kedusha, the greater level of overwhelming level of nether force, therefore it's more intense contamination. Therefore, the remains of the human being contaminates at this unusual level, and the remains of a Jew, where the dimension of the neshama, of the soul, is another dimension. So not only does the remains contaminated upon contact, even if you're within the same room, under the same roof, it generates a higher level of contamination. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh speaks, we find that if you have a korban sacrifice and the sacrificial meat you're permitted to eat, it has to be eaten within a certain time period. If that time period passes and it expires, the meat that's left is called nosar. It's called leftover. What is the liability if you eat nosar? The liability is kares, spiritual excision. So the Chaim HaKadosh asks, if you eat nevelo, eat meat that's not, which wasn't ritually slaughtered. One eats treifa, an animal you slaughter it that you find that has a certain defect. It's a negative commandment. It doesn't carry the liability of kares. So why something that was such a special level of kedusha, of sanctity, and it was a mitzvah to eat it, and now that it reaches its expiration time, not only is it forbidden to eat, but it carries a much more extreme level of liability, liable for kares. That's what the Orach Chaim HaKadosh points out over there. So he explains the same principle, that since initially the korban was innately holy, it's referred to as tush saguf, there's innate kedusha, that is a part of the animal that was brought as a korban on the mizbeach, which is the most advanced level of kedusha. Now that it's been disqualified or not classified as something you're not permitted to eat, but what's its past? Its past was this meat actually contained a level of kedusha which was one of a kind. Now that, although you're not permitted to eat it, that is a trace or remnant of that kedusha. As a result of that, the intensity of these negative forces attach themselves to that meat. Therefore, when you ingest that meat, therefore it has that level of detrimental effect on the ones in neshama. That's why it's kares. That's how he explains it over there. Why for nevela, treifa, meat that's not ritually slaughtered, or you slaughter where it's found to be a defective animal, it's only a lav. The liability is only malchus. Here, it's much more extreme because of its initial level of kedusha, and therefore the liability is kares. That's the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. Record. They should take for you Parah Adumah, Tamima. This red heifer, Tamima. Meaning the redness is total. It's totally red. Asher Ebo Amum, which is unblemished. Ashlo Le'ol. And there was no yoke or anything put on the animal. Take a look at Rashi. Lo yichoi lecho. Lolom hinikris al shimcha. Parah she'osa Moshe b'midbar. The parah, the first red heifer that was made in the desert, identifies as Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the one who oversaw the Parah Adumah. Okay. So the Gemara tells us that every Parah Adumah that was made from that time going forward, some of the ash of that Parah Adumah, Moshe Rabbeinu's Parah Adumah was part of that ash. And at the end, after Mashiach comes, where all Jews will have to be purified with the Parah Adumah, that Parah Adumah is going to be made by Moshe Rabbeinu. So every Parah Adumah until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, every Parah Adumah had some of the ash of Moshe Rabbeinu's. Ash was intermingled with that ash. Now we have no ash. Moshe Rabbeinu will make that last Parah Adumah to purify the Jewish people. Now the question is, why does Moshe have to be this Yichwei Lecha? So the way the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explained it, what is Moshe? What does he represent? He represents Torah. The mechanism through which the transition took place, going from Ben Noach to Yisrael to Atem Kruim Odom, who facilitated that? If there wouldn't have been a Moshe, there was no one qualified to receive the Torah. The only one who was qualified to receive the Torah, as we said, because Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama was the equivalent of the whole Klal of Yisrael. Therefore, Torah and Moshe is synonymous. The basis for the contamination of the dead is what? Is the Torah. Therefore, the one who actually participates in the Parah Adumah, which relieves you of that level of contamination, which is directly based upon your dimension, which is due to the receiving of the Torah at Sinai. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu has to be the one to participate in this, and every Parah Adumah going forward has to have some of the ash of Moshe Rabbeinu intermingled in that ash. And at the end of time, when Klal Yisrael have to be purified from the contamination of the dead, Moshe Rabbeinu will make that Parah Adumah after the coming of Mashiach. Adumah Tmima, Shetei Tmima Bad Mimos. It has to be perfectly red. Shimhoyubo Shtei Saros Choros Psula. If the red half had as few as 2 black hairs, it's not totally red. Totally, you cannot have more than, if you have 2 hairs which are black, it's not totally red. We'll see in a moment. When it's Satimos Eloza Kohen, and you should give it to Eloza Kohen, Votzi Osel Michutz LaMachne. He takes it out of the Machne, V'shocher Osel Lefonov. So Rashi explains, Elozar Mitzvosa Biskam. Elozar was the assistant to his father. Assistant Kohen Gadol. Al Michutz LaMachne. Where do you slaughter it? Chutz l'shlush machnos, outside of all 3 camps. V'shocher also lefonov, zor shochet v'lo roeh. Now, by kochim, although the halacha is that only a Kohen is permitted to officiate by a korban, but the qualification of Kohen only begins from receiving of the blood going forward. But the actual slaughtering, even a non-Kohen, is qualified to slaughter a korban. It's important to know. The Gemara tells us that even a non-Kohen is qualified to do the ritual slaughter on a korban. It's only from the receiving of the blood, transporting the blood, sprinkling of the blood. That's where the Kohen comes into play. But shchitas ksher b'zor. So we had by the Parah Adumah, as he says, it's lefonov. The shchita is only before Elazar. He oversees it. But who does the actual shchita? Azor, even a non-Kohen, is qualified to do the shechita. Elozar takes of the Parah Adumah from its blood with his finger. And he sprinkles it towards the entrance of the Ol Moed 7 times in that direction. He's outside of the Machne. The Sarif is a pearl leinov, and they burn the heifer before his eyes. It's ora, it's hide, it's psora, it's flesh, it's doma, it's blood, it's pirsha, al pirsha, together with all the waste within its system. Yisro, everything is burned totally. But look at the coin, it's eres, Goin takes a piece of cedar wood Azov is a hyssop grass, low-lying grass, shnei tolas, a crimson cloth. And while the porah is being burnt, he puts the three in and they burn together. It's burnt together with the Parah Adumah. V'chibes begodov hakohen. And the Kohen who participates in, he becomes contaminated. Not only is his body, but even the clothing he's wearing are contaminated. They have to put in the mikvah. Rashi. Only then is he permitted to come back to the Machne Shechina. Because the only one who has to be outside the two camps, Elazov, Balkari, Umetzora. Person has a flow, person has a seminal discharge, or a leper, cannot be in the two camps. V'tomei orev, okay. V'asoref osa yichabis begodov b'mayim v'rochitz b'sor b'moyim. Tomei orev. V'osaf ishtor, a sefer aporo. A person who's pure, he gathers the ash. He puts it outside the camp in a location which is pure. And this is kept for keeping for the sprinkling. Chatos. The status of Parah Adumah is chatos. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit. I just want to do the Rashi, which he brings Rav Moshe Darshan. Skip to the Yudalid. Zosa Torah. This is the Torah. Odom Kiyamas Bo'el. This is the law. A man who dies in a tent, Kolaboel Oel, whatever comes into that tent, Chasheba Oel. Whoever enters the tent, or what's contained within that tent, meaning under that roof, Yit Mashib Yomim. The extent of this contamination is the contamination of dead is 7 days, meaning the earliest you can be relieved of this contamination. If you undergo this process for Adumah, it's a 7-day process. We'll see it's on the 3rd and 7th day. You take a look at Tezayin in the Pasuk 16, we had mentioned not only did the remains contaminate, but if you have a metal implement which comes in contact with the corpse or in the room, it assumes the identical status as the corpse itself. Although Kohen is not, there's no provision for him to contaminate himself with that, but nevertheless, it has the same level of contamination. The only way you can be relieved of that contamination is through the Parah Adumah. If a person touches out in the field, he's not under chalal cherev, a sword which came in contact with the dead, or bemes, or the corpse itself, or be'etzem odom, or the bone, or bekever, cover, or the grave. The person was interred in the grave, and you walked over the grave. Yit b'shivas yomim. V'lokhu la'tomei me'afar sefer saporo. And they take for this person who's contaminated with dead of the ash of the Sreifes Achatos, V'nosel of Mayim Chaim El Keli. And you take water, not from stagnant water of a mikvah, but rather it has to be taken from a living wellspring. Nosel of Mayim Chaim El Keli. Water which comes from a source where there's an underground source, El Keli. And here he speaks about the sprinkling. Second. It's interesting. The law is that if a person becomes a Mitzorah, so also over there it says and then he recovers from the leprosy, which comes due to Lashon Hara. It says the Kohen takes water from a living wellspring, puts it in a kli, and he takes two birds, which are of a kosher species. He slaughters one bird, and he dips it lets the blood go on the water, which was taken from a living wellspring. Then he takes the living bird, dips it in that water, and then he sends the bird into the wild. Over there, it's also Mayim Chaim. It cannot be taken of a mikvah. It's not taken out of the laver. It's taken from a living wellspring. It's not from rainwater. Now, and also over there, you take erez. When you sprinkle the water on the Mitzorah, you take a piece of cedar wood, you take the hyssop grass, and you take the crimson cloth. And the crimson cloth you wrap the piece of cedar wood together with the hyssop. So over there, Rashi says, what does the cedar represent? Cedar is a majestic tree. That's gaiva. The hyssop grass is what? It's a low grass. That's humility. That the person who initially was pompous, he should humble himself, and only then he's able to be atoned. Because over there, what's the reason why a person speaks Lashon Hara? Because you believe you have a right to speak your mind and to say anything you choose. You find fault in the other person, but if you realize that you're no less faulty as him, you wouldn't speak about the other person. So the reason why we pass judgment or speak about other people is due to our own sense of self, and that's gaiva. That's the cedar. That's the cedar wood. That's gaiva. The red represents sin, and the hyssop grass represents humility. So over there, the Baal Gaiva should become more humble, and then he'll be atoned for the sin of Lashon Hara, which caused the leprosy. That's Rashi over there. Here we also find by the Parah Adumah, you have the cedar wood, you have the hyssop grass, and you have what? You have the Tolah Shoni. You have the red, the cloth, crimson cloth, and you throw it into the fire, all three together. And they burn with the animal, with the red heifer. And then you take that ash in combination, all the ash of all three, and you put it into Mayim Chaim. Again, Mayim Chaim. Rabbi Akiva says over there in the Midrash, now, a person without a tongue, you can't speak. You're not able to speak. Why was a person given the power of speech? What should you speak out of your mouth? Words of Torah, words that you're permitted to say. Now, where are the salvatory glands? Under the tongue. So rather than, the vessel which you draw water, normally you need a vessel to draw water from a living wellspring. The tongue, that is the vessel which you use to speak. How is this tongue used? The water under the tongue represents Mayim Chaim. What's Mayim Chaim? The Torah is Mayim Chaim. Water, the Torah is compared to water, that gives us life. It's continuously being generated. The salvatory glands, the body's producing this saliva continuously. So rather than taking that tongue and drawing the waters of Torah, of Kedusha, of spirituality by saying words which were appropriate, even more than appropriate, you use that vessel and you drew, what did you draw? You articulate words which were not permitted. Lashon Hara and other words that weren't permitted. Therefore, to correct the wrong, we said the birds represent chirping, right? As birds chirped, you chirped. You said words that you shouldn't have said. You take the crimson cloth, you take the cedar, wood and you take the hyssop. Why did you chirp? Because it was gaiva. It was arrogance. It was haughtiness. Lower yourself. And now, recognizing that, a person utilizes the tongue not for what he had misappropriated it, but rather to say what you should say. That's the corresponding factor to correct the wrong that was done. That's Rabbi Akiva. Over here, we're talking about the contamination of the dead. Why did Adam eat of the tree of knowledge? He was told not to. If God tells you not to, how do you eat of the tree of knowledge? Evidently, he believed that he was permitted. Why did he have this? Why do we have many blind spots in our life? We know it's wrong, but somehow we justify it. We rationalize. Why do we rationalize? Because there's always a degree of sense of entitlement that we feel that if we see it this way, it's justified or it's okay. So basically, the basis for all sin is what is gaiva. It's the ego. Therefore, what was the contamination of the dead? Adam Marisha, that he ate of the tree of knowledge, which ultimately caused death. He justified eating of the tree of knowledge, which Hashem said to him, all the trees, all the fruits of the garden are permitted except one. And that's exactly where he failed. He ate of that fruit, which caused death. So we find that the death itself is rooted in gaiva. That's what brought it about. The Chet Egel. Why did Jews sin with the Chet Egel? Because they made a calculation. Because according to the way they understood it, Moshe was supposed to be back, and he was not back in time. They said Moshe dies. Therefore, based on what we see, the way we understand, we need an intermediary. Although you heard the 10th commandments from Hashem and said, Lo yilecha elim acher al ponai, you should not have any other God other than me. But somehow they fell back on their past, and somehow they justified idolatry. That the Egel was this intermediary replacing Moshe Rabbeinu. So again, the basis for that calculation, for this lack of clarity, is because although you heard directly from Hashem, Lo yilecha acher elim acher al ponai, they failed. This failing was due because they felt they had a right to see it the way they saw it and to rely on that and make a decision. Although the majority of Klal Yisrael weren't involved in the ego. But so the Sefer over there explains that they remained silent and allowed this to take place in their midst, and they didn't stop it immediately, that means it was condoned. And because it was condoned, therefore they were held accountable for the Chet Egel, all Klal Yisrael, for that reason. So again, the cedar wood, by the Egel, the hyssop and the red. We'll see Minish, Moshe Darshan, how he explains what the symbolism of all the aspects of the Parah Adumah is. It corresponds to the Chet Egel. Rashi says he's recording the Medrash which is cited with Moshe Darshan. Vikho elecho. You must take of your own means to purchase this Parah Adumah. Why? Shem porku nizmei zov le'egel b'shalem. As initially by the golden calf, says they took off the gold jewelry and they gave of theirs for the golden calf. Identically, that the Parah Adumah corresponds, and this is an atonement for that. Also, it must be purchased from your own means. Parah Adumah. Why the cow? Moshe ben Shivcha Shetinev Paltin Shamelch. It's analogous to the child of the maidservant who soiled the palace of the king. Amru tovu imov utkaneach atzoa. They say to the mother, come and clean up the feces of your child. Identically, the Parah Adumah comes to atone for the sin which we were involved, which is the calf. The calf is the child of the red heifer. Adumah. Why is it? What's red? What does red represent? Al Shem, im yadimu katola. The Navi says that if your sin is so extreme, it's the equivalent of the redness of a worm. Shachet kori odom. Sin is identified as red. You know, you're in the red or you're in the black. Red is always represents the negative, impurity. Tamimo, Al Shem Shah Yisrael Tamimim. Before the sin of the golden calf, we were Tamimim. We were unblemished, spiritually pure. Venasu Bali Mumim. And as a result of participating in the Egel, we became blemished. Tovuzu Uschaper Aleim. The Yazu the Tamimusam. So you take this animal, which is Tamimo, which is unblemished, and that will reinstate us to our unblemished status. We became blemished due to the sin of the golden calf. Through the mother, we'll be reinstated and we'll be whole again. Lo old. The animal, no yoke was put on it. No burden was put on it. What happened when we did the Chet Egel or we remained silent? We actually, we removed from ourselves the old Shamayim, the yoke of heaven. Elazar HaKohen, Keshem Shenikolo al Aaron, Shu Kohen, Lasus Egel, just as they assembled it on Aaron and they demanded from him, they wanted to make the Egel, the golden calf. Fish Aaron Osis Egel, Lo Nasis Avoduzal Yodo, because Aaron participated in the Egel, therefore he's not the one who oversees the Parah Adumah, but rather it's the assistant Kohen, Godol, which is the son. Shekateg Nasis and Eger. Because the prosecutor cannot be the advocate. Okay? The Sarvis Aporo. What did Moshe Rabbeinu do when he came after he broke the tablets? It says he took the Egel and he burnt it. He burnt the golden calf. So it says Moshe burnt the golden calf. We burn the red heifer, which represents that. Because this is the atonement to correct these three items. It corresponds to the 3,000 people who died due to the Egel, not to the Erev Rav. The Erez to Hagavoah, the cedar is the most majestic of all trees. Vase of Nomchikulam. And the hyssop grass is the lowliest of everything because it grows on the ground. Siman shagavod shizgoyam b'choto. That the person who was pompous and which brought the sin, yashvalatz atzmo ke'ezo v'tolas. He should lower himself like the hyssop and like the worm, the scapolo, and that will bring about atonement. Meaning humility. Humility, person's humble, that will bring atonement. You should be forgiven. I once mentioned the name of the Shalach Korush. David Abel says, Leiv nishba v'nitke elokim lo sivzeh. We said every Shabbos in Psukim de Zimra. Leiv nishbar, a broken heart, v'nitke, which is smattered, elokim lo sivzeh. God will not disgrace. If a person has reached a level of understanding and remorse that he feels devastated and broken, Elokim lo sivzeh. So the Shalach Kodesh explains that the whole concept of tshuva, that it's effective and it rehabilitates the person to be restored as if he never sinned, that is mitzvah rachmim. That is the attribute of mercy. And that's what we discussed many times, that by the korban, which is atonement, it always says korban l'Hashem. The appellation for the God is always Yud Kei Vav Kei, never Elokim. Elokim is always kenotes midas adin, the attribute of justice. By korban, it's always l'Hashem. So the Shalach Kodesh says, however, if a person reaches a level of remorse that he feels devastated, he's broken, smattered, Elokim lo sivzeh. Even the Midas Adin will not come to prosecute him. Even the attribute of justice will be agreeable to accept this level of tshuva. If you reach that level of being totally devastated due to recognition of how bad it was, how extreme it was, what you had done. So what is that? That's the old level of negation, that a person cannot coexist with his past, and he doesn't have the capacity to deal with it. You're totally negated. When you reach a negated state, only then, even the Midas Adin will not prosecute us. Therefore, that's Elokim lo sivzeh. We mentioned the famous pasuk from Koheles, Elokim yivakesh nirdof. Elokim favors the pursued, if you remember. So we had explained that measure goes to show that all the people throughout history who were pursued, even the Midas Adin will not prosecute them. Noach, what was so special about him? Why was he was Motzach Chemei Hashem? The whole generation was destroyed because he was a nirdaf, because he was pursued by the members of his generation. A person is in pursuit state. He comes to recognition that the only one he can rely on is Hashem himself. When you come to that level of negation, that all that exists is God, and without him, you have no existence, that's a level of total negation. When you reach that level of total negation, Elokim lo sivzeh, even the Midas Adin will not disgrace that person. That's Elokim yivakesh nirdof. Elokim favors the nirdof, the pursued one, because he's reached that level of recognition that he has no relevance and he has no say in anything in his life. Everything is dictated by God himself. That's Elokim. But that's what you read. That's based on humility. Sometimes a person has to learn the hard way, and he's reduced to a level of nothingness, helplessness, to realize it's not you, it's Hashem. Therefore, over here, the basis for the Chet Egel was the Jews did certain things, and they thought they had a right to see it the way they saw it. Rather than negating themselves and says, we have a question, we do nothing. What about the question? I don't have to have an answer for every question there is. We don't know everything, but I have to know. And if I don't know, somehow we see it through a lens which may justify whatever is not justifiable.
Rabbi.
Lemishmeres, I just want to do it in the next Rashi. And it's kept for safekeeping. The ash, just as the sin of the golden calf is held on our account as a claim against us for all generations, for all tragedies. Whenever the Jews are punished throughout history, part of that punishment is due to the Chet Egel. Shenemar ubion pokti, on the day of reckoning, ufokarati. On the day of reckoning, when I'm going to reckon for the sin, whatever that transgression may be, I will also reckon the Egel into that reckoning. And just as the Egel tainted all those who were involved, identically, and just as it says Moshe Rabbeinu took the afer, the burnt of the gold, and he sprinkled on the Jews. Shenemar, it says he spread it over the water. Okay. Yes, Alan.
Rabbi, the sin of the Chet Egel